Oh boy, here we go.
Uh-oh.
I'm the king of the world! Wow!
All right, so we're in post-World War II. Now, the U.S. and the Soviets, they were buddies during World War II. They were allies during World War II. But really, these are two countries that are polar opposites. You have the U.S., which is a capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, which is a communist dictatorship. So they were allies in World War II, but really they're polar opposites. The U.S. is a capitalist democracy. The Soviets are communist dictatorship.
Carpe diem. Seize the day.
So in 1945, the three big wigs of the Allied side meet. That's Churchill with Great Britain, FDR with the United States, and Stalin with the Soviet Union. And they agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. So each of them would have a zone, and then just because they felt like it, they'd add in the French. They also agree at Yalta that Stalin's Red Army should leave Eastern Europe, even though he never honors that. So in 45, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin meet at Yalta. They agree to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. And they agreed that the Soviets would leave Eastern Europe and the places that they were occupying.
We got a little problem.
So in 45, the three sides meet again, but this time it's Truman, a different British Prime Minister, but still Stalin. Stalin again refuses free elections in Eastern Europe and the places the Red Army occupies. So the three sides meet again. So it's Truman, Stalin, and the next British Prime Minister, and Stalin again refuses to grant Eastern Europe and the places he occupies free elections. So following the Potsdam Conference in 45, the Soviets are now the threat. The world and the Allies, they see the Soviets and communism as the threat. Churchill said that an iron curtain descended over Europe. So there's now a split between democratic West and communist East. So Churchill said in a speech that the iron curtain descended over Europe, and now there's a split between the democratic West and the communist East.
Show me the money! Show me the money!
All right, so the easiest way for a country to switch to communism is the economy sucks. So Truman got Congress to pass $400 million worth of aid to both Turkey and Greece to prevent that spread, to prevent communism from spreading there. So the quickest way to communism peeking its ugly head in a country is that the economy sucks. So Truman got the U.S. Congress to pass $400 million worth of aid to Turkey and Greece to help prevent the spread of communism to those countries. This also is the first sign of the policy of containment, keeping communism in the countries that it already is. So this is the first sign of the policy of containment. Truman wanted to keep communism where it already was.
Show me the money!
Another part of the containment policy is the Marshall Plan, which was proposed by George Marshall. And this gave $13 billion to Europe after World War II, to Western Europe after World War II, to recover, to buy supplies, and to prevent the problems that generally led to communism. So the Marshall Plan gave Western Europe $13 billion to recover, to buy supplies, and generally prevent the problems that led to communism.
Well, this sounds like it's gonna be hard.
So one of the key bones of contention between the US and the Soviets is the city of Berlin. Berlin was actually deemed too important, so it was split into 4 occupation zones, even though the city falls in the Soviet zone of occupied Germany. So one of the bones of contention between the US and the Soviets was the city of Berlin, Germany. It was so important that they actually split it into 4 occupation zones, even though it was in the Soviet zone of occupied Germany. So Stalin decides in June of 48, I've got to get the United States and the rest of them out of Berlin without a war. So his way of doing that was, let's cut off all ground transportation to West Berlin, because in the end they won't be able to get supplies. So in June of 48, Stalin says he wants to get the U.S. and the British out of Berlin without causing a war. So he says, oh, well, we'll just cut off all ground transportation. Then they won't have supplies, and eventually they'll have to leave. Truman and the British responded by just airlifting those supplies in, and Stalin, realizing this was a bad plan, eventually backs off. So Truman and the British respond by just airlifting the supplies needed in, and Stalin backs off. So in 1949, even though alliances got everybody in trouble, the US, the British, and 12 others formed their alliance against the communists, and it's called NATO. So in 1949, the US, the British, and 12 other countries say, we don't like the communists, and we're going to form a group against them called NATO. NATO still exists today. Obviously, it's not fighting communism like it used to be. The Soviets, of course, are going to respond, and they have their own group of alliance of countries with all their Eastern European countries called the Warsaw Pact. So the Soviets respond with an alliance of their own called the Warsaw Pact. Alright, so in 1952, when Eisenhower becomes president, yes, the same Eisenhower who was the conventional general of World War II, he decides that we're not going to spend billions of dollars on conventional forces. We're going to spend our money on nuclear weapons. And this sets off an arms race between the Soviets and the United States, which includes the space race. So in 1952, when Eisenhower becomes president, he decides no more conventional forces. We're not going to spend billions of dollars on them. We'll have one, but not as much. But we'll have lots and lots of nukes where we can kill everybody. And it sets off an arms race between the Soviets and the United States, which includes the space race.
You are a sad, strange little man.
Now, in 1959, Fidel Castro takes over in Cuba. He has a revolution in Cuba, and he quickly aligns himself with the Soviets. So in 1959, Castro takes over in Cuba, and he quickly aligns himself with the Soviets. That's a major problem for the U.S., to have a Soviet ally so close. And so the CIA draws up a plan to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles. So Ike has the CIA draw up a plan to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles. Not U.S. troops, Cuban exiles. Now, when JFK comes to the presidency in 1960, the CIA's invasion plan falls on him. And the people convince him, they say, JFK, it'll work. And so JFK authorizes the CIA plan to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles. It's a massive failure. They invade at the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans were there to meet them. And it's a massive failure, partially because JFK would not get U.S. planes involved. So in 1960, JFK authorizes the plan to invade Cuba with Cuban exiles, and they invade at the Bay of Pigs, and the Cubans don't have anything of it. It's a massive failure, partially because JFK wouldn't put any U.S. planes involved.
Imagine you're President of the United States. Your advisors come to you with a plan to overthrow a hostile government that threatens American security. The plan would solve a major problem if it worked, but you worry that it won't. What do you do? I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the Bay of Pigs invasion, which began on April 17, 1961. The road to the Bay of Pigs began 2 years earlier when Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's U.S.-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Relations between the two countries quickly soured. Castro denounced decades of U.S. political and economic domination of Cuba. He called for revolutions throughout Latin America, and he seized properties that U.S. firms owned in Cuba. What especially worried Washington, though, was Castro's growing ties to Moscow. It was the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union looked to be on the march around the globe. So President Dwight Eisenhower and his advisors looked at Castro in fear that the Soviets would soon have a beachhead less than 100 miles off America's shores. By March 1960, Eisenhower had had enough. He authorized a CIA plan to train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The plan, eventually codenamed Bumpy Road, rested on the premise that the attack by Cuban exiles would trigger a popular uprising in Cuba that would overthrow Castro. Eisenhower had reason to be confident that the plan would work. 6 years earlier, the Central Intelligence Agency had engineered the ouster of a leftist government in Guatemala. Operation Bumpy Road could not be executed before Eisenhower left office. The decision on whether to proceed was left to his successor, John F. Kennedy. JFK had doubts about the wisdom of Operation Bumpy Road. He knew that a decision to intervene overtly in Cuba would be criticized at home and especially abroad. But he also knew that ousting Castro would fulfill his campaign promise of a tougher foreign policy and strengthen his hand in dealing with the Soviets. And he saw a real political cost to killing the operation. Some of the hundreds of Cuban exiles, and probably a few U.S. government officials as well, would complain to the press that he had walked away from the plan that would have toppled Castro. That would have exposed JFK to damaging charges that he was soft on communism. So JFK gave a green light to Operation Bumpy Road, but in doing so he made two critical decisions. First, because he wanted to minimize overt U.S. involvement, he severely limited the U.S. air support for the mission. CIA and U.S. Air Force officials went along with the restriction because they assumed he would change his mind if the operation ran into trouble. Second, he chose a more remote landing site for the operation, the Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, it was a lousy spot for an amphibious landing. The invasion force of 1,511 exiles, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. The operation was a disaster from the start. Castro's army wasn't surprised, ordinary Cubans did not rise up in revolt, and JFK refused to send the U.S. military to save the Cuban exiles pinned down on the beaches. On April 19th, Brigade 2506 surrendered. The 3 days of fighting had left 140 exiles dead and nearly 1,200 captured.
On that unhappy island, as in so many other arenas of the contest for freedom, the news has grown worse instead of better. I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way.
The Bay of Pigs is one of the biggest U.S. foreign policy fiascos of the 20th century. There are many reasons it failed besides JFK's refusal to authorize air support. The underlying premise that ordinary Cubans would come to the invasion's aid was flatly wrong. The invasion was poorly organized and managed. It also wasn't much of a secret or a surprise to Castro. The New York Times ran two separate stories on its front page about the U.S. efforts to train a Cuban army in exile. What is the lesson of the Bay of Pigs? Just this: be prepared for failure and plan accordingly. JFK had doubts about the wisdom of the CIA's plan, and he knew that he would not order a direct U.S. military intervention. So he put all of his eggs in hoping that Operation Bumpy Road would work. It didn't. Had JFK thought through the possibilities of failure, he might have canceled the operation or fundamentally reshaped it. As it was, he was left to lament, "How could I have been so stupid to let them go ahead?" Presidents don't want to find themselves asking JFK's question about their own decisions. So recognizing the potential for failure and taking steps to minimize it is a fundamental challenge for all types of foreign policy making. But it is especially important when talking about decisions to use military force. To take just one example, it is fine to discuss how military strikes might blunt Iran's nuclear ambitions, but that analysis is incomplete unless it also grapples with how a military strike might fail or create an entirely new set of problems to handle. So here's a question to consider. What steps should presidents take to make sure that they are thinking through how their policies might fail rather than simply engaging in wishful thinking about how they will succeed? I encourage you to weigh in with your answers on my blog, The Water's Edge. You can find it at CFR.org. I'm Jim Lindsay. Thank you for watching this installment of Lessons Learned.
Alright, so in August of '62, the US discovers those big bad Soviets are building nukes in Cuba. Cuba's pretty darn close to the United States, so it's a direct threat to the US and the Panama Canal. So JFK says, get those nukes out of here. So in August of 62, the U.S. discovers those big bad Soviets are building nukes in Cuba. With the nukes being a direct threat to the U.S. and the Panama Canal, JFK says, you got to get those nukes out of Cuba.
I can't take it anymore!
JFK works for a diplomatic settlement, and he finally gets it after 6 very tense days when he agrees to not invade Cuba anymore, and he says, we will quietly, we can't have this out in the press, take missiles that are out of date that we have out of Turkey and Greece. So JFK worked for a diplomatic settlement, and after 6 tense days, he got it. And he got it for agreeing to not invade Cuba anymore, and for quietly agreeing to take missiles out of Turkey and Greece that were outdated.
You're a very bad man.
Bunch of savages in this town.
So after World War II, the problems with the Soviets caused another Red Scare in the United States. People were scared of a Soviet takeover in the U.S. And so the government begins to take action. The first thing they did is called the Smith Act, and the Smith Act makes it illegal to teach the overthrow of the government. So it basically makes communism illegal, because if they don't have socialism and communism, they teach you to actually overthrow the government. The House Committee on Un-American Affairs also begins investigating people, including a group of directors and writers from Hollywood called the Hollywood 10. And the Hollywood 10 were actually blackballed from Hollywood, which means they can't work, because of this investigation. And the government also investigates and sometimes even executes spies, including an investigation of the main Manhattan Project scientist Oppenheimer. So after World War II, the U.S. has another Red Scare, and the government takes action through 3 ways. 1, the Smith Act, which makes it illegal to teach the overthrow of the government. 2, the House Committee of Un-American Affairs, who investigate people like the writers and directors of the Hollywood 10. And 3, they investigate and even sometimes execute people that they think might be spies. It includes an investigation of the lead Manhattan Project scientist, Oppenheimer.
What's his deal?
Now, in February of 1950, a little-known senator named Joseph McCarthy did this. He held up a piece of paper at a speech. On that piece of paper, he said, are communist spies and communists in the State Department. And he did it all for notoriety and to get reelected. So in February of 1950, the little-known senator Joseph McCarthy holds up a piece of paper that basically says, and he says, these are all the communists in the State Department. And he did it for notoriety and to get reelected.
What's his deal?
In the next 4 years after this election, Joseph McCarthy becomes one of the most powerful politicians in Washington. And he accuses many of being communist, including George Marshall, who gave all the money to Europe to prevent communism. So in the next 4 years, McCarthy becomes one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, D.C., and he investigates and accuses a whole bunch of people of being communist, including George Marshall, who's the one who came up with the plan to give a whole bunch of money to Western Europe so they won't turn to communism.
I've had enough of you pushing me around.
In 1954, McCarthy goes after the army. And this led to live TV hearings where people could see what McCarthy was doing with their own eyes. And really, the way he treated the people from the army led to a loss of many of his supporters. And eventually, he's censured by the Senate. So in 1954, McCarthy says there are communists in the army. And this led to a bunch of TV hearings where the American public's looking at it like, and seeing what McCarthy's actually doing. And it leads to the loss of many supporters. And it even has the Senate end up censuring him, which basically means they slap him on the wrist and say, you're a bad, bad boy, McCarthy.
hear that? It's the winds of change.
Now, before Japan invades China in 1937 during World War II, there's a fight in China. There's a fight between a nationalist group led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek and the commies led by a man named Mao Zedong. And it's a war over China, a war over the Chinese government. Now, during World War II, the two sides actually get together briefly to fight Japan. So before Japan invaded in 1937, there's a war in China, a war over the Chinese government, between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the commies led by Mao Zedong. But during World War II, they actually say, let's get together, and they fight Japan together.
Show me the money!
Now, following World War II, the war is back on. And guess who supports each side? Of course, the United States is going to support Kai-shek, and the Soviets, with Mao being a communist, are supporting Mao. Now, with a poor economy in China, the nationalists were actually taking money from the US and lining their own pockets, while Mao was promising to feed the people, so he was gaining public support. So following World War II, the Civil War starts up again. And of course, the US is going to support the non-communist in Kai-shek, and the Soviets are going to support the communist in Mao. And the Kai-shek and the nationalists, they were actually taking the money from the United States and putting it in their own pocket, while Mao's promising to feed the people. So of course, Mao's gaining the public support.
Oh, you smell like a winner!
Now in 1948, Mao's forces start dominating this war. So Kai-shek turns to the United States and says, I need military support. The US, realizing that he's corrupt, says, yeah, no. And so in 1949, Kai-shek actually escapes to the island of Taiwan, and the nationalists set up their own government on the island of Taiwan. So in 1948, Mao's forces dominated the war, and it causes Kai-shek to say, US, I need some money. And the US says, no, you're pretty corrupt. And so Kai-shek actually escapes to Taiwan, and the nationalists set up their own government in Taiwan.
This will not look good on a resume!
So with the nationalists leaving, what's that mean? It means China's now communist. And in the United States, guess who they blame that on? None other than the president, and that was Truman. So this meant China's now communist, and Truman takes the blame in the US. Now, after World War II, because the Soviets and the US were fighting together, and the Soviets actually come in on the side of the US against Japan, they agreed to actually divide Korea. Korea was divided into two parts. The North was going to be the communist part, and the South the democratic part. US troops, US occupation troops, actually began to pull out of Korea in 1949. And this coincided with the communist victory in China. So there's going to be a problem. So after World War II, Korea split into two parts. The North is communist, the South's democratic. In 1949, the US occupation troops that are there, they start to pull out, and it actually coincides with the communist victory in China. Now, in June of 1950, the North Koreans say, the US is gone! And they invade the South. And they actually push the South Korean forces all the way to the southernmost tip city called Pusan. Truman provides aid because he knew that he could not just appease the North. This was not going to work. Remember, appeasement didn't work with Hitler, so it's not going to work here. So in June of 1950, North Korea says, the US is gone. Let's invade and go and and unite Korea. And the South gets pushed all the way to the port city of Pusan. Truman says, I'm not going to stand for this, and he provides aid because he knew he could not go to the policy of appeasement. It didn't work with Hitler. Now, Truman's actually able to get the UN Security Council to agree to take action in South Korea. So the US troops would be fighting under the UN flag. Now, usually the Soviets have a veto on the UN Security Council, but the Soviets were actually boycotting the UN Security Council because it was not recognizing Zedong's government as the legitimate government of China. So Truman actually gets the UN Security Council to vote to take action in Korea. And so it meant that U.S. troops are going to fight under the UN flag, not the U.S. flag. And he was able to get past what usually is a Soviet veto because the Soviets weren't actually there because they were pissed off that the UN was not recognizing Zedong's government as the legit government of China. Now, because they're fighting under the UN flag here, this is a thing that changes U.S. history forever. Truman does not need to go to Congress and get a declaration of war. This is the first war that was not declared by Congress, and it's the first of many because we haven't had a declared war since World War II. And so Truman also turns around to the occupation troops that were still in Japan and says, you need to go to Korea to fight. They were unprepared, they were occupation troops, and they weren't very well trained to fight a battle here. And so they were soon being pushed on the retreat to Busan. So with the UN resolution, Truman changes precedents forever by saying we don't need a declaration of war since the U.S. troops are going to fight under the UN flag. Then he goes to the troops that are in Japan, occupying Japan, and says you need to go to Korea and fight. They were occupation troops. They were unprepared and they weren't trained very well. And soon they were retreating to Busan also. Now, on September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launches a counterattack at the port city of Incheon. This was actually behind Korean lines. The Koreans were not expecting this because the waters off Incheon were pretty hard to land ships on. By October of 1950, the North Koreans had been driven back across what is the middle of Korea, the 38th parallel. So on September 15, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launches a plan of attack where he attacks at the port city of Incheon, which was actually behind the North Korean line. The North Koreans weren't ready for it because they thought that you couldn't land ships at Incheon. And so by October of that year, the North Koreans were actually back across the 38th parallel, which is the border in the middle between South and North Korea. Now, Truman had to decide if he was going to call this war good, if he was going to call it over, or if he was going to push past the 30th parallel and actually try to reunite Korea. So he goes to MacArthur and he says, what should I do? MacArthur says, push past. And so Truman allows MacArthur to push past because he did not think the Chinese would intervene. So Truman had to decide if he was going to call this war good, if he was going to call it over, or if he was going to push past the 38th parallel and try to unite Korea. He goes to MacArthur and says, should I do it? And MacArthur says, yeah, sure, the Chinese won't intervene. And so he allows MacArthur to push past the 38th parallel. Now, MacArthur pushes past the 30th parallel and all the way to the northern border that North Korea shares with China. And guess who comes into the war? 300,000 Chinese attacked U.S. troops. And so outnumbered, MacArthur's forced to retreat. So MacArthur actually pushes all the way to the Chinese border with North Korea, and then 300,000 Chinese get into this war. MacArthur's outnumbered, and he's forced to retreat. Now, with China in the war, Truman's got a huge decision to make. Do we maybe use a huge number of troops and maybe even have to use the bomb, or do we stop at the 30th parallel? MacArthur, of course, favored total war. He said, let's use some nukes. What's it matter? Truman favored stopping at the 30th parallel. So with China now in the war, the U.S. faces a big decision. Do we commit a huge number of troops and maybe have to use the bomb, or do we stop at the 30th parallel? MacArthur, of course, being the general, said, yeah, let's go. If we have to use nukes, whatever. Truman said, let's stop at the 30th parallel. So, of course, MacArthur's pissed. He doesn't want to stop at the 30th parallel. And MacArthur gets pissed, and he writes a letter to Congress saying that Truman is a bad president and criticizing Truman. So when Truman finds out, he says to MacArthur, hey, you're fired. And there's a huge public outcry because MacArthur's a war hero, and MacArthur actually comes and delivers this big, massive message in a joint session of Congress. So an enraged MacArthur sends a letter to Congress saying Truman is the worst guy ever and criticizing him up one side and down the other. Truman turns around and says, "Hey, MacArthur, you're fired." And there's a huge public outcry because MacArthur's seen as a war hero. He actually even gets to deliver a message to a joint session of Congress. So between 1951 and 1953, the Allies had regrouped and they'd actually stabilized. They continued to fight small battles, but the war was pretty much stalemated. So between 1951 and 1953, the Allies had pretty much regrouped and stabilized. They continued to fight small battles across the 38th parallel, but pretty much the war was a stalemate at this point. Now, ending the war became an issue in the election of 1952, with Dwight Eisenhower getting elected. When Ike starts hinting, I might use nuclear weapons here, and Stalin's actually dead, the communists go and say, oh, we don't have any choice. We're going to sign a ceasefire, and they do in 1953. So ending the war became an issue in the election of 52. Ike says, I might use nuclear weapons, and Stalin's now dead. And so it convinced the commies that, yeah, we got to sign the ceasefire in 1953. And the ceasefire, really, all it does is say, we're going to stop firing at each other.
Shh, 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 shh. Do you hear that? It's the winds of change.
Now the effects of the Korean War. First off, it doesn't really change Korea. The north of the 38th parallel, still commie, still today, and south is still democratic. So it really does not change Korea. North is still commie, south is still democratic. One of the biggest changes it makes, though, is it sets the precedent that a president does not need a declaration of war to send troops. So one of the biggest changes this actually makes is it sets the precedent that the president does not need a declaration of war to send troops. It also leads to the formation of SEATO. SEATO is basically NATO in Asia. So it's an alliance to prevent communism. So this leads to the formation of SEATO, which is basically NATO in Asia, which is an alliance to prevent communism.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is called cold because it supposedly never heated up into actual armed conflict, which means, that it wasn't a war.
Mr. Green, but if the war on Christmas is a war and the war on drugs is a war...
You're not going to hear me say this often in your life, me from the past, but that was a good point. At least the Cold War was not an attempt to make war on a noun, which almost never works because nouns are so resilient. And to be fair, the Cold War did involve quite a lot of actual war, from Korea to Afghanistan, as the world's two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, sought ideological and strategic influence throughout the world. So perhaps it's best to think of the Cold War as an era, lasting roughly from 1945 to 1990. Discussions of the Cold War tend to center on international and political history, and those are very important, which is why we've talked about them in the past. This, however, is United States history, so let us heroically gaze, as Americans so often do, at our own navel. Stan, why did you turn the globe to the green parts of not America? I mean, I guess to be fair, we were a little bit obsessed with this guy. So the Cold War gave us great spy novels, independence movements, and arms race cool movies like Dr. Strangelove and War Games, one of the most evil mustaches in history. But it also gave us a growing awareness that the greatest existential threat to human beings is ourselves. It changed the way we imagine the world and humanity's role in it. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, William Faulkner famously said, "Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" So today we're going to look at how that came to be the dominant question of human existence and whether we can ever get past it. So after World War II, the US and the USSR were the only two nations with any power left. The United States was a lot stronger. We had atomic weapons, for starters, and also the Soviets had lost 20 million people in the war, and they were led by a sociopathic, mustachioed Joseph Stalin. But the US still had worries. We needed a strong, free market-oriented Europe, and to a lesser extent Asia, so that all the goods we were making could find happy homes. The Soviets, meanwhile, were concerned with something more immediate, a powerful Germany invading them again. Germany, and please do not take this personally, Germans, was very, very slow to learn the central lesson of world history: do not invade Russia, unless you're the Mongols. So at the end of World War II, the USSR encouraged the creation of pro-communist governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, which was a relatively easy thing to encourage because those nations were occupied by Soviet troops. The idea for the Soviets was to create a communist buffer between them and Germany, but to the US it looked like communism might just keep expanding, and that would be really bad for us because who would buy all of our sweet, sweet industrial goods? So America responded with the policy of containment, as introduced in diplomat George F. Kennan's famous Long Telegram. Communism could stay where it was, but it would not be allowed to spread. And ultimately, this is why we fought very real wars in both Korea and Vietnam. As a government report from 1950 put it, the goals of containment were 1. Block further expansion of Soviet power, 2. Expose the falsities of Soviet pretensions, 3. Induce a retraction of the Kremlin's control and influence, and 4. In general, foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system. Harry Truman, who, as you'll recall, became president in 1945 after Franklin Delano Pres for Life Roosevelt died, was a big fan of containment, and the first real test of it came in Greece and Turkey in 1947. This was a very strategically valuable region because it was near the Middle East, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but the United States has been just like a smidge interested in the Middle East the last several decades because of oil, glorious oil! Right, so Truman announced the so-called Truman Doctrine because, why not name a doctrine after yourself, in which he pledged to support, quote, freedom-loving peoples against communist threats, which is all fine and good, but who will protect us against peoples, the pluralization of an already plural noun? Anyway, we eventually sent $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, and we were off to the Cold War races. The Truman Doctrine created the language through which Americans would view the world, with America as free and communists as tyrannical. According to our old friend Eric Foner, the speech set a precedent for American assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances directed against the Soviet Union. It also led to the creation of a new security apparatus, the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, all of which were somewhat immune from government oversight and definitely not democratically elected. And the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine also laid the foundations for a military buildup, an arms race, which would become a key feature of the Cold War. But it wasn't all about the military, at least at first. Like, the Marshall Plan was first introduced at Harvard's commencement address in June 1947 by, get this, George Marshall, in what turned out to be like the second most important commencement address in all of American history. Yes, Stan, okay. It was a great speech, thank you for noticing. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The Marshall Plan was a response to economic chaos in Europe, brought on by a particularly harsh winter that strengthened support for communism in France and Italy. The plan sought to use U.S. aid to combat the economic instability that provided fertile fields for communism. As Marshall said, our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Basically, it was a new deal for Europe, and it worked. Western Europe was rebuilt so that by 1950, production levels in industry had eclipsed pre-war levels, and Europe was on its way to becoming a US-style capitalist mass consumer society, which it still is. Kind of. Japan, although not technically part of the Marshall Plan, was also rebuilt. General Douglas MacArthur was basically the dictator there, forcing Japan to adopt a new constitution, giving women the vote, and pledging that Japan would forswear war, in exchange for which the United States effectively became Japan's defense force. This allowed Japan to spend its money on other things, like industry, which worked out really well for them. Meanwhile, Germany was experiencing the First Berlin Crisis. At the end of the war, Germany was divided into East and West, and even though the capital, Berlin, was entirely in the east, it was also divided into east and west. This meant that West Berlin was dependent on shipments of goods from West Germany through East Germany, and then in 1948, Stalin cut off the roads to West Berlin. So the Americans responded with an 11-month-long airlift of supplies that eventually led to Stalin lifting the blockade in 1948 and building the Berlin Wall, which stood until 1991 when Kool-Aid got... No, wait. That wasn't when the Berlin Wall was built. That was in 1961. I just wanted to give Thought Bubble the opportunity to make that joke. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So right, the wall wasn't built until 1961, but 1949 did see Germany officially split into two nations, and also the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and NATO was established, and the Chinese Revolution ended in communist victory. So by the end of 1950, the contours of the Cold War had been established. West versus East, capitalist freedom versus communist totalitarianism. At least from where I'm sitting. Although now apparently I'm going to change where I'm sitting, because it's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, and about 55% of the time I get shocked by the shock pen. We must organize and enlist the energies and resources of the free world in a positive program for peace, which will frustrate the Kremlin design for world domination by creating a situation in the free world to which the Kremlin will be compelled to adjust. Without such a cooperative effort led by the United States, we will have to make gradual withdrawals under pressure until we discover one day that we have sacrificed positions of vital interest. It is imperative that this trend be reversed by a much more rapid and concerted buildup of the actual strength of both the United States and the other nations of the free world. I mean, all I can say about it is that it sounds American and like it was written in like 1951, and it seems kind of like a policy paper or something really boring. So I mean, yeah, I'm just gonna have to take the shock. Ah! National Security Council Report NSC 68. Are you kidding me, Stan? Not 64 or 81, 68. This is ridiculous. I call injustice. Anyway, as the apparently wildly famous NSC 68 shows, the US government cast the Cold War as a rather epic struggle between freedom and tyranny, and that led to remarkable political consensus. Both Democrats and Republicans supported most aspects of Cold War policy, especially the military buildup part. Now, of course, there were some critics, like Walter Lippmann, who worried that casting foreign policy in such stark ideological terms would result in the U.S. getting on the wrong side of many conflicts, especially as former colonies sought to remove the bonds of empire and become independent nations. But yeah, no, nothing like that ever happened. Yeah, I mean, it's not like that happened in Iran or Nicaragua or Argentina or Brazil or Guatemala. Or, Stan, are you really going to make me list all of them? Fine. Or Haiti, or Paraguay, or the Philippines, or Chile, or Iraq, or Indonesia, or Zaire. I'm sorry, there are a lot of them, okay? But these interventions were viewed as necessary to prevent the spread of communism, which was genuinely terrifying to people, and it's important to understand that. Like, national security agencies pushed Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies like The Red Menace, which scared people, and the CIA funded magazines, news broadcasts, concerts, art exhibitions that gave examples of American freedom. It even supported painters like Jackson Pollock and the Museum of Modern Art in New York because American Expressionism was the vanguard of artistic freedom and the exact opposite of Soviet socialist realism. I mean, have you seen Soviet paintings? Look at the hardy ankles on these socialist comrade peasants. Also, because the Soviets were atheists, at least in theory, Congress in 1954 added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance as a sign of America's resistance to communism. The Cold War also shaped domestic policy. Anti-communist sentiment, for instance, prevented Truman from extending the social policies of the New Deal. The program that he dubbed the Fair Deal would have increased the minimum wage, extended national health insurance, and increased public housing, Social Security, and aid to education. But the American Medical Association lobbied against Truman's plan for national health insurance by calling it socialized medicine, and Congress was in no mood to pay money for socialized anything. That problem goes away. But the government did make some domestic investments as a result of the Cold War. In the name of national security, the government spent money on education, research in science, technology like computers, and transportation infrastructure. In fact, we largely have the Cold War to thank for our marvelous interstate highway system, although part of the reason Congress approved it was to set up speedy evacuation routes in the event of nuclear war. And speaking of nuclear war, it's worth noting that a big part of the reason the Soviets were able to develop nuclear weapons so quickly was thanks to espionage, like for instance by physicist and spy Klaus Fuchs. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Fuchs worked on the Manhattan Project and leaked information to the Soviets and then later helped the Chinese to build their first bomb. Julius Rosenberg also gave atomic secrets to the Soviets and was eventually executed, as was his less clearly guilty wife, Ethel. And it's important to remember all that when thinking about the United States' obsessive fear that there were communists in our midst. This began in 1947 with Truman's loyalty review system, which required government employees to prove their patriotism when accused of disloyalty. How do you prove your loyalty? Rat out your your coworkers as communists. No, seriously though, that program never found any communists. This all culminated, of course, with the Red Scare and the rise of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, an inveterate liar who became enormously powerful after announcing in February 1950 that he had a list of 205 communists who worked in the State Department. In fact, he had no such thing, and McCarthy never identified a single disloyal American, but the fear of communism continued. In 1951's Dennis versus United States, the Supreme Court upheld the notion that being a communist leader itself was a crime. In this climate of fear, any criticism of the government and its policies, or the US in general, was seen as disloyalty. There was only one question: when will I be blown up? And it encouraged loyalty because only the government could prevent the spread of communism and keep us from being blown up. We've talked a lot about different ways that Americans have imagined freedom this year, but this was a new definition of freedom. The government exists in part to keep us free from massive destruction. So the Cold War changed America profoundly. The US has remained a leader on the world stage and continued to build a large, powerful, and expensive national state, but it also changed the way we imagine what it means to be free and what it means to be safe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is created by all of these nice people, and it is possible because of you and your support through Subbable.com. Subbable is a crowdfunding website that allows you to support stuff you love on a monthly basis. Our Subbable subscribers make this show possible. Thanks to them. If you value Crash Course, please check out our Subbable. There are great perks there. And thanks to all of you for watching. As we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Wait. Stan, is that music copyrighted? All right. It's not. Whew. Let's save this $1,000.